So, hi and welcome to our first meeting. I'm going to go into presenter mode, so I will not be able to see your lovely faces, and I hope I can see if somebody else tries to join. That's my one concern. No, that's not what we want to look at. Where am I? I want to go here. So what I had prepared for tonight was the gospel passage for this coming Sunday. And before we start, I think we should probably pray. So I will try to do that to the best of my ability. So Shem Abu Wabaruchu Kadisho Had Alo Shahiro Amin. Abunde Bashmayo Nethakada Shmo Titha Malkutho Newe Sebiono Akano de Bashmayo. Ofbaro Habelan Lachmode Sunkonan Yamono Washapuklan Haubein Wachtohain. Akano Dofanan Spakan the Hayobein Lotalan Neseyuno Elo Fasolan and Bisho Mitul Ziloch Hi Malkutho Wahailo Weteshbuchto Lo Lam Amin Amin. Nobody make fun of my accent. So thank you, Lord, for this opportunity, and we'll take a look at the passage Mark 22:23 through 28, so the Gospel of St. Mark. And I just wanted to read it to you. I'm going to move my face out of the way, though. So this passage is actually, it has a header of the going through the wheat fields. And what the actual passage says, and I picked this from the Peshitta, which is, of course, our own Syriac New Testament in its English translation, as it was offered up by Gorgias Press in their publication. And so Mark 2:23 through 28 reads, while Jesus was going through the wheat fields on the Sabbath, his disciples were walking along, plucking ears of wheat. The Pharisees said to him, see what they are doing on the Sabbath. What is not lawful? Jesus said to them, have you never read that what David and those with him did when they were in need and hungry? How he entered God's house when Abiathar was chief priest and ate the bread of the table of the Lord, which was not lawful for anyone to eat except for the priests. And he also gave it to those who were with him. The Sabbath was created for the sake of people, he told them, and not people for the sake of the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath. Glory be to God. So what I wanted to do tonight, just to get us started, as we're getting into these Bible studies, is to give you a little bit of a historical background and then also look at some of the parallel passages that explain a little bit better what we're looking at. And I also want to say, I can't see who is on the call, but you are welcome to interrupt me at any time and ask questions. I want this to be a dialogue, not a monologue. But for tonight, I have prepared something that gives us a little bit of a discussion basis. And so I wanted to just give you a little bit of a historical background of the Gospel of St. Mark. And it's interesting to note that the Gospel itself does not tell us who the author is. But what we see in the early church fathers, so for example, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, so this is like 2nd century, Clement of Alexandria, they affirm Mark as the author. Now, Mark is a name that was fairly common in those days as well. And so which Mark are we talking about? And so the Mark in view appears to be John Mark, and I'm going to just jump on my iPad here into the book of Acts, and if you have a Bible next to you, you can do the same. So a book of Acts is in the New Testament right after the Gospels, and we're going to take a look at Acts 2:12, and I'll probably have to put on my glasses because it's dark here. So Acts 2:12 says all no, I'm sorry, 12:12. I was going to say that does not sound right, Elke. Acts 12:12. It says, as soon as he realized that he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was Mark, where many had gathered and were praying. So this is John Mark, and we'll encounter him again in verse 25 of chapter 12, where it says, then after completing their mission, Barnabas and Saul, who will be Paul eventually, returned to Jerusalem and brought with them John, whose other name was Mark. And then they apparently had a falling out because in Acts 13:13, I don't know if it's a falling out or if they just decided to part ways. In Acts 13:13 it says, "Then Paul and his companions set sail from Paphos and came to Perga in Pamphylia. John, however, left them and returned to Jerusalem." So they parted ways at that point in time, but that's the John Mark that we believe is the Mark that is the author of the Gospel of Saint Mark. So what does that mean if you think about it from a timeline perspective? I mean, this is that he was pretty parallel from a timing perspective with the apostles and with the activities going on there with Paul and Barnabas traveling on their missionary journey. So we know from church history that Paul was killed in the mid-60s by Emperor Nero in Rome. And so this is happening before that period of time. It's favored that this gospel was written in Rome by Saint Mark. Again, there is no scripture evidence from that. This is just a conjecture of some of the elements that we see in the gospel that lead us to believe that that was probably the place where Mark found himself at that point in time. And the time of the writing appears to be the late 50s to 60s AD, because a lot of it indicates that there's awareness of what is happening with persecutions in Rome. And again, as I just mentioned, Paul ultimately is killed in Rome by Emperor Nero. The Gospel of St. Mark is a unique gospel because it's actually the shortest of our four Gospels. And it's very to the point, very, in a way, apocalyptic, the way it's written. And it's very short. And that's why some Bible scholars believe that that's actually the baseline for some of the other writings that we have. And in particular, the three what are called synoptic Gospels, which are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And the reason they're called that is because there is a similarity, shall we say, between these Gospels, not necessarily in the way how they're written or whom they seem to address, but rather that they share many similar stories. So you can find certain parables, for example, in these Gospels, or certain occurrences that happen in the Gospel across all three of these Gospels. This is very unlike the Gospel of St. John, which stands out in that respect, that it's written completely differently than those three synoptic Gospels. So I'll pause for a second. Is there any question on that? Okay. The other thing I wanted to say is that this particular passage we're looking at tonight is what Bible scholars consider a pericope. It's a interesting word because you don't normally use it in everyday talk, but what it means is that it forms a cohesive unit, so that people actually understand this to be a single occurrence. Now, this was not in any way available in the ancient Bible. Of course, these headers, like for example here, the going through the wheat fields as the header, that's simply the translators or the translation team's decision to give the story title so people can find it more readily as they're reading. And other Bible translations may contain different headers. It's not part of the actual biblical text. So if I go, for example, I have on my iPad, I have opened the New Revised Standard Version, and if I go to Mark 2 and look at that particular passage, it says pronouncement about the Sabbath as the header. So you can see that that translation team just used a very different title for that particular pericope. The Bible verses themselves are a fairly recent addition. Well, in history, they've been around for a while, but in the overall history of the Bible, they were only added in about the 15th century for the Old Testament and the 16th century for the New Testament. So, of course, in the early days, there were manuscripts which were then ultimately replaced by the more book form of how we have texts available to us. So the original gospel manuscripts did not have chapters or verse numbering. So again, there's a lot of pronouncements that have been made on top of the text by certain groups of people that were translators or have transcribed the scriptures. The oldest original manuscripts that we have were written in Koine Greek, which is not the classical Greek. It's more of a colloquial Greek of the time. But there is a group that argues for an Aramaic primacy, and they contend that the Gospels were first written in Aramaic and then translated into Greek. So that is a hypothesis that's also out there. Is of course very interesting for us as Syriac Orthodox, that there may have been Aramaic language manuscripts that may or may not be as readily available as the many Greek manuscripts of the New Testament that have been found and that have been transmitted through the centuries. So just want to give you a little bit of just how do we read this? What does this mean when I see a header above one of these, again, called pericopes? It just means that it's the cohesive unit that we find in this case here in verses 23 through 28, which describes one story. Any questions so far?
Yes. So
Okay.
when you say Koine Greek,
Mhm.
can you make a distinction by how it is Roman Empire but also Greek language? Because a lot of times I think people separate the two, but a lot of times it was conflated. It was actually concurrent at the same time, you know?
Yeah, correct. I mean, Greek was the lingua franca at the time in the Roman Empire. So if we think about Alexander the Great, so that Hellenistic element, that Greek element is what Hellenistic means, that moved forward into the Roman Empire. And we can see that also when we read in the book of Acts, for example, about the first deacon, Saint Stephen, when they decided who would become deacons to help the church in Jerusalem. There was a disconnect between the groups because one group was more Judaic, more Jewish, and the other was more Hellenistic or Greek. And so they picked certain characters. So kind of imagine today in the Syriac Orthodox Church, we have the Indian Syriac Orthodox. So, you know, in Phoenix, there is an Indian Syriac Orthodox Church. And then we have the Arabic speaking St. Mary's Syriac Orthodox Church in Phoenix. So it's kind of similar. There's different cultural groups that were represented there, but Koine Greek was actually the common language at that time. And we, of course, know that Aramaic filled a very similar position in history. And that's why there is this argument that these Gospels were written in Aramaic. Jesus spoke Aramaic. We're pretty certain of that. And did he speak fluent Greek? Did he speak fluent Latin? We just don't know from the scripture evidence. It's entirely possible because he was a tradesman. I mean, he was a carpenter, so he would have been in various Roman cities to do business. And I'm pretty sure he spoke some level of Greek and maybe even Latin. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So then the Old Testament background, why does Jesus refer? So if we look at this passage again, and what Jesus says to the Pharisees is, have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food, how he entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and he gave some to his companions. So if we look at this text here in the Old Testament, this is from 1 Samuel 21. If you read it in the Septuagint, it's 1 Kings 21, so the nomenclature is different. But basically what this tells us is the story of how what Jesus is addressing to the Pharisees, what the ancient precedent for that was. And so David is, of course, nobody else but King David before he was king. So at that point in time, Saul was the king of Israel. Saul, in a couple chapter prior to 21, in I think chapter 19, it becomes very clear that Saul is out to kill David. And David is really close friends. I mean, close brotherly love between him and King Saul's son, Jonathan. And so Jonathan was kind of had the ears to the ground, what was happening with his father, couldn't understand why his father hated David so much. And so in chapter 20, they make this little deal where Michal, who's David's wife, puts a doll almost in their bed to make it look like he's sleeping. And then when the guards come in to grab David because King Saul wanted him arrested and killed, he has since escaped. And so him and Jonathan had an agreement that Jonathan would keep his ear open what was going on, and that he would alert David by shooting arrows in a field and having his servant come and gather up the arrows. And if the arrows fell short of David, it meant that it was safe for him to come back to the court. If they went beyond him, it meant he had to flee. So he shot them beyond David because King Saul was adamant to kill David. And so David fled with his men, and he came to Nob, which is a city in Israel, to the priest Ahimelech. And Ahimelech, it's interesting to note, because here it says Ahimelech, and in the text that we have in Mark, it says Abiathar. So you see that a lot in scripture, that there's different names used, but they're dealing with the same person. And I'm not sure I can quite explain that right now. But Ahimelech said, why are you here, and why is there no one with you? I mean, probably his men had stayed behind. And he said to him that the king had charged him with something, and no one must know about this. And can I have an appointment to meet my men? And we're really hungry. So do you have something to eat for us? And he says, give me 5 loaves or whatever you have to eat. And so the priest answered David that he doesn't have any normal bread there right now, but only what's called the showbread, or the holy bread. And if you read in the setup of the temple, they were like a rack where they would have what's called showbread that would be replaced once a week. So it was basically a food offering to the Lord, but when the bread was exchanged every week, the priests would actually eat that kind of like a holy bread. And so the priest obviously is well aware that that's not to be given just to anybody, but he kind of compromises and said, I have this bread, I can give it to you if you can promise me that your young men have kept themselves from women, so that there's some level of, you can almost call it like fasting before communion in a way, right? And so David says, yes, they have been kept from women when they go on expedition, and they're holy. Even when it's a common journey, how much more today when, they will be receiving this. And so the priest gave him that holy bread because that was the only bread that was there, because they were actually exchanging it for the new hot bread that was going to be replaced there on the racks in the actual temple. So that's kind of the Old Testament background to this. And so now fast forward again, if we switch to one of the synoptic gospels, again, just meaning that it basically retells the same story a little bit differently. So in St. Matthew, in the gospel, we see this same episode kind of spelled out a little bit differently. I don't know that we have to read the entire section here, but it's interesting for me to note in this particular version that Jesus actually not only refers the Pharisees back to what David and his companions did, but he refers them back to the law of the Sabbath. And what he's saying is that the priests in the temple break the Sabbath law, and yet they're guiltless. So in other words, the Sabbath law said that you are not to do any work on the Sabbath. You are to rest. That's what God had told his people. But the priests obviously were in the temple on the Sabbath, and they would have sacrifices. They would have replaced the showbread, do all these things. And so what Jesus is saying here, I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. And so for them, they're probably scratching their heads. What does that mean? What does that mean? What is he even saying? And he also quotes then, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. So he's taking them back to the Old Testament, where God says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And he says, you would not have condemned my disciples for picking the grain if you would live this out. And he's telling them the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And we'll talk about why that particular statement is of great relevance. But so he's taking them back to their own law, and he's saying, you guys are guilty of this. You break this every Sabbath. And here is something greater than the temple, and needless to say, he's referring to himself. So I think that's noteworthy here in St. Matthew. And then we have the same New Testament parallel also in the Gospel of St. Luke. And here it's a little bit abbreviated, but it gives you the same kind of story. And again, he says the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. So I guess the what I wanted to take you back to is, what did one of our church fathers say about this? And the reality is, he didn't say anything about the Gospel of St. Mark, but St. John Chrysostom, who died in the year 407, he did comment. He had homilies on the Gospel of Matthew, and part of that was that he commented on this parallel passage in the Synoptic Gospel. And it's kind of interesting to see some of the things that he is saying, that the disciples of Christ, they're freed from this figure of the law, and they are united to the truth, who is Jesus Christ. They're not keeping this figurative feast of the Sabbath because something greater than the temple has arrived, as we just read. And so they're also much more guilt-free because they're hungry, and they're eating very simple food, not for pleasure or anything like that, but because they're very hungry. And the Pharisees, on the flip side, they're accusing the disciples of doing wrong. And again, that's what Jesus is pointing out to them, is that if they had mercy, if that was what was primarily on their mind, about God not giving this law to make people suffer, much on the contrary, if there was somebody that needed help and saving on a Sabbath, that was absolutely allowed. Like if your animal fell into a hole, you were allowed to pull them out, of course. So that's what Christ is pointing him back to, that he's pointing him to David, who had a much greater impact experience there, because he was actually getting the holy bread from the temple, whereas his disciples, simply because they were hungry, were plucking a few grains of the wheat fields there. And then St. John Chrysostom also points out that he calls himself the Lord of the Sabbath and the Son of Man, because he is deigned to be called the Son of Man, but for the sake of man. And what he's pointing out here is, to kind of translate that, the law has no authority over the lawgiver and Lord, for more is allowed the king than is appointed by the law. So in other words, what John Chrysostom is pointing out to us is that the Sabbath law is only as big as the person that gave that law. And who was that but the Lord? So the Lord is the lawgiver. And so really what we're seeing here is that Christ, in this case, is above that law because he is the king, he is the lawgiver. And so he's really pointing out to them exactly who he is. And that kind of leads me into the questions that I brought with me today. So if we think about this particular passage, what happened just prior? Who's questioning Jesus? Who's asking? I've said it a couple of times, so it should be pretty clear that who's having the problem with his disciples. It's not the average Jewish person on the street, right? It's who is it?
The Pharisees.
The Pharisees, correct. So they're trying to trip him up, and it's really kind of interesting because if you see in the Gospel of Mark, there's an episode right prior to that, or a pericope, the question about fasting, where again the Pharisees came to him and said to him, let me read it real quick. Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and people came and said to him, "Why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" Jesus said to them, "The wedding attendants cannot fast while the bridegroom is with them, can they? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast on that day." And he goes on to say more to that. But so the Pharisees were simply trying to trip him up because they're trying to establish that he cannot possibly be anything but a lunatic, or somebody that needs to be kicked out of the temple, basically. So yeah, go ahead.
And also, that passage just read, the disciples of John the Baptist.
Yep. Also,
not John his disciple.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that is also, if you remember, they also had question about, who are you really? Are you really the Christ, or who are you? And so it's really interesting how Jesus iteratively brings them to the realization of who he actually is without necessarily spelling it out cut and dried. But what did he seek to achieve in this encounter? And again, I think that became clear with what I just said a second ago, and it's also the last bullet here. He's calling himself the Lord of the Sabbath, and so he's highlighting to the Pharisees that he is the lawgiver, that he is God. And so, people always say Jesus never calls himself God in the scriptures, and I would say yes, he does. He just doesn't do it directly in such a manner. There's other passages where he will say, before Abram was, I am, in the Gospel of St. John, for example. If you don't know the Old Testament, if you don't know that God chose that name to describe himself, I am, then you can't understand why they got mad at him and started throwing stones at him. But so he has these veiled references that are clear to the Pharisees, to those that have been studying the law, but he does not straightforward come out and say that in a way that will greatly inflame that situation. But he does tell them that he is the lawgiver, so that he is above that Sabbath law that had been given. And he's also reminding them, if we think about the St. John Chrysostom commentary, he's reminding them that this Sabbath rest was a gift from God to his people. It was never intended to be a burden. It was supposed to give them the rest that their bodies needed from a whole week's worth of work. And so between these two elements, he's reminding them that they are actually putting themselves even above the law with what they're suggesting, is that really the law was given not as a burden, but as something that was to protect the people. And being that he is the Lord of the Sabbath, he explains to them it's absolutely appropriate that his disciples, who were simply hungry, would do something that these Pharisees are guilty of all the time on the Sabbath, but working.
I think
mhm.
also he uses the phrase "Son of Man," and "Son of Man" was an indication to the Pharisees directly that he is expressing his divinity and his role and position as a lawgiver and
Yeah,
a
absolutely.
lawmaker.
Absolutely. I mean, these men were very well educated, and if we look in where am I? Let me see if I can find this right away. I think it's Daniel 12, but I may be wrong. No. Where the Ancient of Day comes, and it talks about somebody like the Son of Man in that vision, right? So I gotta find it real quick. 1 second. So in Daniel, thank goodness for search functionality. Daniel 7, sorry. Daniel 7, in the Old Testament, it talks about, starting in verse 9, as I watched, thrones were set in place, and an ancient one took his throne. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, and its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and flowed from his presence, out from his presence. 1,000,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood attending him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were open. And it goes on. And then in verse 13, it says, as I watched in the night visions, I saw one like a human being, like the Son of Man. That's Aramaic, one like the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. And he came to the Ancient One, was presented before him. To him was given dominion and glory and kingship, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away, and his kingship is one that shall never be destroyed. So you're absolutely right, Noor. This title, Son of Man, is also indicative exactly, and that should have reminded them of this passage in Daniel 7 as well. So yeah. I mean, it's really astounding when you read a couple of verses in the Gospels, how you realize there's so much more and so many riches, but you have to know the backgrounds to the stories. So, for example, this episode with King, not yet King David, but David in the Old Testament, where he goes to the priest and gets the showbread from him, that is directly related by Christ, and it's something that the Pharisees were very familiar with, and he's relaying to them why he, as the Son of Man, as you correctly said, why he is the Lord of the Sabbath, and that it's perfectly okay for his disciples to eat the grain. So anyway, that's really all I had prepared for tonight, because I wasn't quite sure what we would wind up doing. But I mean, give me feedback. Does that make sense? Does that help to put this in the context? What are you looking for when we meet?
I like the context a lot. I feel like it requires you to think and connect the dots, because the message of Jesus is not just, because he said, I'm not coming to contradict, I'm coming to like complete things. So obviously he's going to build on whatever happened before and happened prior to his physical.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
I
No, I
feel
think
like
it's really.
also
Go ahead.
having like this type of like context also gets you more familiar with the Old Testament, which is very hard to read sometimes.
Yeah.
So
No, good. I mean, that's kind of what I'm hoping, is to, when you read a passage like that, why did he say that, and what's the relevance, right? So that we can maybe pick up the interest in the Old Testament. I happen to love the Old Testament. I did my master's in Old Testament. But yeah, I agree with you. I mean, it's without some level of guidance into it, it's very hard sometimes to understand. And you kind of got to know what are the historical pieces, what are the prophetic pieces in there, and so on and so forth. But yeah, no, it was interesting that this passage popped up as the first one to think about, because it took me right back into my my love with the Old Testament. So that was nice. But yeah, so I mean, I would love to hear feedback, and if you're watching this as a recording, please offer feedback how you would like to structure the time. I don't want to just be the one talking. I just think as we begin, it may be helpful for me to give you a little bit of the framework, and then we can start exploring more. Also, I guess the question is, the idea of using the gospel passage for this coming Sunday, is that something that you think is worthwhile, or should we look at other things? So those are all things I'm pondering, and I'll take recommendations on and feedback.
I feel like it's safe to start to stick to the calendar year, because we go through it every year, but
Right.
rarely have like the time or resources to ponder. So I like that. Yeah.
Okay, good. All right. Well, I mean, we're at 7:45. I think we might just wrap it up then, because unless you have some other comments or some other recommendations, I'd be happy to entertain them, of course.
Can we do off recording?
Yep. Hold on. I can get back to what I'm doing here. Manage recording. Oh, there. Okay. Stop recording.